I've remembered to put on my, usually I get up here and can't understand why I can't read it, but anyway. Good evening. It's lovely to see you, and I'm Anne Burley, and I'm a member of the lecture committee, but I'm here to introduce our speaker. Now, we have a slightly unusual arrangement tonight. Our speaker is actually sitting down there, Toby, and Nikki up here is going to be doing some readings. There were technical reasons why we couldn't have them both on the platform. But as soon as I get done, Toby will come up. Toby Brothers is the founder and director of the London Literary Salon, and Nikki Mayhew is the associate director. Toby conceived and developed the Literary Salon in Paris before moving to London in 2008. For more than a quarter of a century in France, the USA, and Japan, as well as in the UK, she has taught and led literary seminars on subjects ranging from creative writing to women's literature and film, from Black American literature to world religions and wisdom traditions, not forgetting Shakespeare, Proust, Joyce, and Melville. Her students include adults, secondary, and primary school pupils. And Toby is very much in demand as a speaker at the moment. Tomorrow she will be going to Paris to give a talk to the leadership group of the Ulysses European Odyssey. If you want to know what that is, you can ask her later. Anyway, Toby, please come up.
Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you so much to the Highgate Society and to Anne in particular. This is a lovely opportunity for the London Literary Salon and for me in particular. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, our Zoom audience. So, Ulysses, famously daunting book. So I'm going to do something I'm going to ask in the audience, and there is no shame. I'm going to ask if you wouldn't mind raising your hands if you have never read Ulysses. Just beautiful, great. I'm really going to be talking to you all this evening. Would you please raise your hands, no shame, if you have tried to read Ulysses and stopped partway through? There you go, all right. Well done for trying, well done for trying. And would you please raise your hands if you have read Ulysses? Be proud, there you go. Beautiful, beautiful, great, great. So I have to admit to being a bit overwhelmed in the face of this talk. There is just so much I want to say about this great work of Irish literature and its impact on narrative art form and on readers. But mostly, I just want to encourage you to read or reread this exuberant, challenging, and lyric book. What I will offer you this evening is my personal experience with the text. I have dedicated much of my adult life to teaching, exploring, reading, and rereading, and guiding hundreds of readers through this book. And I remain passionate about it. I'm going to give you 5 good reasons and 1 bad reason for reading Ulysses in the hope that I will persuade you. First off, pretty much any reading is good. But why? Really ask yourself, why do we read? Beyond the nagging guilt that there are books that you should read, through reading we learn, we ingest, we get history, we get ideas, but we also read to be expanded and sometimes challenged in our understanding of other experiences of life across time, culture, gender, ethnicity. Reading can be a delicious solitary pleasure but also an opportunity to meet and build community through a shared engagement with a book, and the way that a particular book requires us to think in new ways. Reading, a slow, deferred gratification, attention-demanding pursuit, has survived the onslaught of less arduous forms of media and entertainment because at some level, we recognize that there are some mind journeys that cannot be summed up in a tweet. You need to go the distance, and there are mammoth works that ask you to go far. Ulysses, based on Homer's immortal Odyssey, is undoubtedly one of those works. This leads us to the underlying question for Ulysses. If it is so famously difficult, why should I devote my precious time to what may ultimately be a frustrating endeavor? 100 years on, is it really worth the effort? My answer, unsurprisingly, is an emphatic yes. This book offers huge empathy for the human condition and a serious interrogation of xenophobia. At its simplest, Ulysses is about a city, Dublin in 1904, and a collection of characters wandering about one summer's day. Nothing globally significant happens, but then somehow so much happens. One of the great gifts of this book is to show me again and again how the mind's arc on a day in an ordinary life can be measured in heroic terms, even when battles have not been fought and won, even without gods and monsters slaughtered. What we think and feel, what memories and images trip about in our minds, the brief epiphanies that we have on the practice of living, the insights into the strangeness of our own particular moment in history. It is all this and more that Joyce brings so joyously and explosively to the surface through language. There are three dominant characters: Stephen Dedalus, Leopold Bloom, and Molly Bloom. It is a book of wandering across the city, across time, and through the mind. Stephen Dedalus is a brilliant young man who is struggling to find a home for the energy of his mind. He is also struggling with poverty, bad eyesight, an alcoholic and tempestuous father, grief for his recently deceased mother, and the weight of expectations, his own and others, on his early scholarly success. Leopold Bloom is an ad canvasser, an appreciator of women, a sensual being, a friend to animals, the descendant of Jewish people living in Hungary, as well as Irish ancestors, a curious and sympathetic soul. A womanly man, an outsider inside the social traffic of Dublin. He loves his wife Molly and daughter Millie. Thoughts of his dead son, Rudy, flow constantly throughout his mind. Molly Bloom is the final, emphatic voice of the text. But we hear about her long before we hear from her. She is a singer of some repute and a woman of charm, sexual frankness, and desire. How these three, each of whom is in their own way an outsider, pass through the long day of June 16th in 1904. How they overlap in physical as well as mental spaces, how they struggle against the everyday oppressive forces of the world they inhabit. This is what Ulysses is about. One of the key aspects of Ulysses is exploring the experience of xenophobia, the fear and hatred of the other. The other is figured as anyone outside of the tribe, a community, a group that I, consciously or not, identify as my people. In 2023, we are more conversant with the structures and repercussions of othering, as manifested in racism, anti-Semitism, sexism, fear of migrant populations. More conversant, perhaps, but we still struggle terribly to be humane to each other. Joyce chooses to center Ulysses on the experience of Leopold Bloom, who is figured as an outsider by his Dublin community because of his Jewish ancestry. Joyce explores what it is to be Bloom. Yes, the ugly anti-Semitism, but also the way his position as an insider-outsider gives him a unique and wider perspective on food, other countries, Catholic rituals, sexuality, social and political structures. He also manifests an engaged and curious mind, as well as a focus on the beauty and the wonder of this world, qualities that are often associated with the Jewish orientation towards the glories of the immanent world. Joyce also includes references to Jewish holidays, rituals, songs, and historical figures as they move through Bloom's mind. So the reader is situated in Bloom's perspective and sees how his ancestral history of that diaspora and the search for a homeland imprints itself on his perspective. Howard Jacobson describes Joyce's Ulysses as the greatest Jewish novel of the 20th century. Joyce was very explicit about the connections he saw between the Irish and Jewish peoples in terms of exile and colonialism. The book is written while he is in exile in Trieste, Zurich, and Paris, and after the Easter Rising of 1916. Ireland, the first colony, once again made a bid for independence, and Joyce had a very sophisticated and deeply critical view of nationalism. Ulysses was and remains groundbreaking, extending and building on the power of the modernist vision. I don't think I truly understood what impact a book could have had until I spent time in Ulysses. Joyce blasts readers' expectation of the form and structure of literary art, and in so doing, shows what is possible, what can change the mind in terms of orientation and deeper self-awareness, as well as a compassionate understanding of others, more sophisticated reading skills, and a greater sensitivity to language. It was revolutionary in 1922, and it remains so a century later. Any consideration of Ulysses must take into account the cultural context in which the book was conceived and published as the 20th century dawned. The birth of modernism in all forms of artistic expression, literature, poetry, drama, visual arts, music, ballet, architecture, fashion, design, represented a rejection of the past and a quest for the new. Joyce, along with other writers such as Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, was forging an entirely new approach to literature. In Ulysses, Joyce begins by disorienting the reader. This is part of what makes the work so challenging. Most readers enter a text looking for a plot. What happens and why does it matter? Joyce shifts our focus to the power and process of language, how it is said, what connections, how imagery and metaphor evoke thoughts, what allusions, internal rhythm, tone, tilted meaning, how all these aspects of figurative language push beyond the discrete meaning and reach beyond the limits of formal rhetoric. Just in case this sounds a bit dry, come in and taste a bit. This is from the first episode as Stephen looks out to the Irish Sea on the morning of the 16th of June. Wood shadows floated silently by through the morning peace from the stairhead seaward where he gazed. Inshore and farther out, the mirror of water whitened, spurned by light-shod hurrying feet. White breast of the dim sea, the twining stresses 2 by 2, a hand plucking the harp strings, merging their twining chords, wave-white wedded words shimmering on the dim tide. Which leads us to reason number 4. Joyce's experimentation with language and stylistic innovation. Language is the blunt instrument that we have to express the incredible complexity of our internal lives, and it is inadequate to the task. When I try to explain something particularly emotionally heavy or psychologically complex that I have experienced, I struggle to find the words. Joyce has read everything and understands the power of language as well as its limitations. He draws on so many diverse philosophical ideas, literary genres, and classical texts to reflect the collage of sources that one person manifests. While Joyce acknowledges the gap in language's ability to truly say what we mean, his work reflects his playing with what is possible and showing how language reveals our inner selves, even, perhaps often, when we don't intend it to. One of the renowned characteristics of Ulysses is Joyce's dramatic, stylistic experimentation. Each episode is written in a different style. These assorted styles work on multiple levels, revealing the connections between moments in the book being described and their placement in the web of history, showing how tone and tenor shape the reader's understanding of a character or event, revealing the interaction between the style of a telling and how authority is claimed or resisted through that style. There are also comic and serious connections to the parallel episodes in the great work on which it is based, Homer's Odyssey. For example, in the episode Aeolus, we find ourselves in the newspaper offices of the Freeman's Journal, Dublin's leading nationalist paper, reading an apparently objective third-person narration. The chapter consists of a series of articles set apart by headlines, which grow more and more outrageous as the episode goes on. Those slightly rambunctious females. KMA, kiss my ass. Diminished digits prove too titillating for frisky frumps. Yet can you blame them? The Homeric counterpart here is Odysseus' visit to Aeolus, god of the wind. Joyce renders the production of the daily organ in terms of wild winds blowing a lot of hot air. The chapter contains, according to Stuart Gilbert, who took the time to count them, more than 80 examples of rhetorical forms, and is also about speech-making and power. The ironic space that grows between the headlines and the content also reflects how news is shaped by the teller and by the way it is told, how it is announced in the Freeman's Journal newspaper office, how ideas, words, and men are blown about, just as we are buffeted by the onslaught of media, the way our world is shaped by the news of the day. Not much has changed. Reading Ulysses is also fun, full of humor and metaphysical exploration, and puns. Joyce loves puns. Humor, what is referred to as Joyce's Jocko-serious method, threads throughout the work. Joyce, given his Jesuit education and vast reading, was conversant and invested in how philosophical ideas reveal the mind. The giants whose shoulders he stands upon include Aristotle, Augustine, Giambattista Vico, Aquinas, Giordano Bruno, the fathers of philosophy, but also often controversial figures who questioned the dogma of their times, sometimes losing their lives to their ideas. A group of early Irish scholars who were revered by the court of Charles the Bald in the 9th century composed masterpieces of pantheism, but also had their own special dwelling called the House of Hilaritas. As Richard Kearney explains in his essay on Proteus, the 3rd episode in Ulysses, this was not only because they laughed constantly and amused King Charles the Bald, but also because their pantheist philosophy spoke of a divine comedy, combining opposing streams of creation and confounding metaphysical dualisms between spirit and matter, body and soul, created and uncreated, being and non-being, nature and supernature. If we can laugh in the space of that, we're doing pretty well. Joyce reveled in this vision of God incarnate in nature, in all the aspects of the human body and the sensory universe, as well as the sense of play that these scholars evoked. He was also far from averse to the pleasures of a dirty joke. Readers of Ulysses can find themselves weighed down by the illusions and the philosophical musings of Stephen Dedalus, especially in the 3rd episode, which, by the way, is when many first-time readers run aground. Many readers and critics come to understand that Joyce's portrayal of Stephen in this episode and his immersion in Platonic, Aristotelian, and other metaphysical ideas is, in fact, ironic. Joyce is making fun of his younger self in the figure of the unclean, lost, and lonely young man, wandering the sandy Mount Strand, trying to find solid ground under his feet and in his mind. But reflecting back to the Jocko-serious approach, as well as the hilaritas of the Irish scholars, we must move fluidly with Joyce. The ironic tone of Stephen as he explores the world of phenomena, or of Joyce's embedded laughter at Stephen for being too caught up in his world of thought and sense to take a bath, bounces back to curiosity about what we are, where we come from, and what creator or force made us. These are the questions that float and dance through our minds as all of us live our lives. For Stephen, his calling as an artist of the eternal imagination demands that he answer these questions. Then, only then, can he be a creator of new and unique art. Listen, for example, to the thoughts that move through Stephen's mind as he walks along sandy Mount Strand, trying to determine what he sees and feels in the world around him, as well as what his connection is to the capital C creator and to his more local creators. Nikki is going to read this for us.
They came down the steps from Leahy's terrace prudently, Frauenzimmer, and down the shelving shore, flabbily, their splayed feet sinking in the silted sand. Like me, like Algie, coming down to our mighty mother. Number one swung laudily her midwife's bag, the other's gamps poked in the beach. From the Liberties, out for the day, Mrs. Florence McCabe, relict of the late Patrick McCabe, deeply lamented, of Bride Street. One of her sisterhood lugged me squealing into life, creation from nothing. What has she in the bag? A misbirth with a trailing navel cord, hushed in ruddy wool. The cords of all link back, strand and twining cable of all flesh. That is why mystic monks. Will you be as gods? Gaze in your omphalos. Hello, Kinch here. Put me on to Edenville. Aleph, Alpha, naught, naught, 1. Spouse and helpmate of Adam Cadmon. Heaver, naked Eve. She had no navel. Gaze. Belly without blemish, bulging big, a buckler of taut vellum. No, white-heaped corn, orient and immortal, standing from everlasting to everlasting. Womb of sin. Wombed in sin darkness I was too, made not begotten. By them, the man with my voice and my eyes, and a ghost woman with ashes in her breath. They clasped and sundered, did the coupler's will. From before the ages he willed me, and now may not will me away or ever. A lex eterna stays about him. Is that then the divine substance wherein Father and Son are consubstantial? Where is poor dear Arius to try conclusions, warring his life along on the contrans magnificent Jew-tangentiality? Ill-starred heresiarch. In a Greek water closet he breathed his last, euthanasia. With beaded mitre and with crozier, stalled upon his throne, widower of a widowed sea, with upstiffed omophorium, with clotted hinder parts. Airs romped around him, nipping and eager airs. They are coming, waves. The white-maned seahorses, champing, bright wind bridled, the steeds of Manannan.
Beautifully done, beautifully done. I forgot I gave her a thunder word. The Wakians in the room will recognize what that is. Beautifully read. The cords of all link back, strand entwining, cable of all flesh. That is why, mystic monks, will you be as gods? Poor Stephen. By playing with these words, you can come up with multiple associations and meaning here. Certainly there is the meaning of the umbilical cord, and the passage concerns Stephen watching two midwives move along the sand with a bag of something. Afterbirth? What? But the created word, strand and twining, also includes stranded, entwined, captured, even as the being is set adrift. Isn't that the experience of birth? And then the chords lead Stephen and us to the image of a phone as he imagines dialing up Eve. Even when the text seems to grab your attention less or challenge you, know that there's rich excavation to be done. Oh, and now for the bad reason to read this book, guilt. When asked what book they most regret or feel guilty about not reading, the answer is often Ulysses. There are so many good reasons for reading this extraordinary book. It would be a great pity to be motivated by guilt or regret or shame. Whether you've tried and haven't gotten through or you've been deterred in the past, I hope I've convinced you to have another go. If so, I'd like to suggest a few strategies to make it easier. In my first encounter with Ulysses in 1987, I was surprised at how much pleasure I found in simply reading through the first time, restraining myself from looking up all the references, checking the concordances, etc. Just reading. And relishing the wordplay, the lyricism, the dance of thought and perception. I recommend, if at all possible, reading as far as you can on your own, sitting in the complexity of the text, letting the language wash over you. This is not meant to be an active reading, absolutely not. Notice and note what pieces fly together, what connections the language offers you. Just for starters, notice the puns and wordplay. Joyce loves them and makes them work. The audible versions are also extraordinary. You have a lot of choices there. You will notice I use chapter headings borrowed from the Odyssey. This is an accepted means of organizing the text, even though no edition includes these in the body of the work. Joyce at one time considered using these chapter titles, but ultimately excluded them from the published work. I think his comment was people got a little bit too hung up on them. Oh, maybe he didn't say hung up. On page 23 of the introduction in the Penguin Ulysses, you will find a chart that Stuart Gilbert developed with Joyce that breaks down the 18 chapters in terms of their Homeric parallels, symbols, the body parts they connect to. I have found this chart illuminating, even if I do not follow all the correspondences. Joyce chose to use Homer's epic poem, The Odyssey, as a scaffold on which to build his own epic of a modern person. Joyce also weaves in Hamlet, Dante's Divine Comedy, Paradise Lost, and many other canonical works as reference point and thematic overlaps. A lot of dance hall music verses as well. For example, in Stephen's introduction in the first few chapters, you will see a lot of echoes of Hamlet's sullen presence from the beginning of the play. And Joyce includes direct quotes from Shakespeare in Stephen's exchanges. But it is the Odyssey that is both the structuring work and the constant reference, in part because Joyce was fascinated with the man of many turns, the husband, king, warrior, trickster, mummer, wanderer, lover, and the father that is Odysseus. The charge of the modern artist to make it new is what Joyce does, using the epic poem that defines the hero, but adjusting it to a modern setting. Not a warrior, but an advertising canvasser. Not a king, but a man with a deeply empathic view of all people and living creatures, and a plan for a more equitable society. Not focusing on absolute sexual fidelity to his wife left behind, but you'll have to read it. If I chose one concordance, I would recommend Harold Blamires' very friendly work, The Bloomsday Book. Episode by episode, Blamires helps the new reader get a leg up into each new realm. Don Gifford's Ulysses Annotated is a great resource for looking up particular references as you go, but you can get lost in it. And Declan Keybird's Ulysses and Us, with Marilyn Monroe reading Penelope on the cover. I hope she read the whole thing. It's just pure pleasure. I think we have time. Should we do another reading? I think we should do another reading.
I understand she did read it all.
Okay.
It was during her Arthur Miller period.
That a girl. I'd love to know what she thought of Penelope. What Nikki is going to read now is the first 2 pages of Calypso. So this is where we meet Leopold Bloom for the first time.
And may I just interject and say that I'm a vegetarian. Mr. Leopold Bloom ate with relish the inner organs of beasts and fowls. He liked thick giblet soup, nutty gizzards, a stuffed roast heart, liver slices fried with crust crumbs, fried hen cod's roes. Most of all, he liked grilled mutton kidneys, which gave to his palate a fine tang of faintly scented urine. Kidneys were in his mind as he moved about the kitchen softly, writing her breakfast things on the humpy tray. Gelid light and air were in the kitchen, but out of doors, gentle summer morning everywhere. It made him feel a bit peckish. The coals were reddening. Another slice of bread and butter, 3, 4, right. She didn't like her plate full. Right. He turned from the tray, lifted the kettle off the hob and set it sideways on the fire. It sat there, dull and squat. Its spout stuck out. Cup of tea soon. Good. Mouth dry. The cat walked stiffly around a leg of the table with its tail on high. Meow. Oh, there you are, Mr. Bloom said, turning from the fire. The cat mewed in answer. and stalked again, stiffly round a leg of the table, mewing. Just how she stalks over my writing table. Scratch my head. Mr. Bloom watched curiously, kindly, the lithe black fawn. Clean to see, the gloss of her sleek hide, the white button under the butt of her tail, the green flashing eyes. He bent down to her, his hands on his knees. "Milk for the pussins," he said. "Meow," the cat cried. They call them stupid. They understand what we say better than we understand them. She understands all she wants to. Vindictive, too. Wonder what I look like to her. Height of a tower? No, she can jump me. "Afraid of the chickens she is," he said mockingly. "Afraid of the chook-chooks. I never saw such a stupid pussins as the pussins." Cruel, her nature. Curious mice never squeal. Seem to like it. "Meow," the cat said loudly. She blinked up out of her avid, shame-closing eyes, mewing plaintively and long, showing him her milk-white teeth. He watched the dark eye slits narrowing with greed till her eyes were green stones. Then he went to the dresser, took the jug Hanlon's milkman had just filled for him, poured warm bubbled milk on a saucer, and set it slowly on the floor. "Roar!" she cried, running to lap. He watched the bristles shining wirily in the weak light as she tipped 3 times and licked lightly. Wonder, is it true if you clip them they can't mouse after? Why? They shine in the dark, perhaps, the tips. What kind of feelers in the dark, perhaps? He listened to her licking lap. Ham and eggs? No. No good eggs with this drought. Want pure fresh water. Thursday. Not a good day either for a mutton kidney at Buckley's. Fried with butter, a shake of pepper. Better a pork kidney at Dulgat's. While the kettle is boiling. She lapped slower, then licking the saucer clean. Why are their tongues so rough? To lap better, all porous holes. Nothing she can eat? He glanced round him. No. On quietly creaky boots, he went up the staircase to the hall, paused by the bedroom door. She might like something tasty. Thin bread and butter she likes in the morning. Still, perhaps, once in a way.
Isn't that lovely? Beautifully read. Notice how the cat slides into Molly, and there are ways in which they echo each other. Michael Grodin wrote the book about living with Ulysses, and he finishes with this. More than any other book I've read, Ulysses tells me about life's sadness, but also about its basic comedy, about the inner strength and dignity of an outwardly unassuming person, like Bloom, like my father, like me, and about the sheer exuberance and joy of communicating through language. Thank you all for coming this evening, and I hope what I've offered you gives you a reason to reach up and dive into Ulysses, or any other challenging work, whether you read on your own, or as part of a supportive group, or even join one of our annual studies of Ulysses. I hope you find in the writing the joy and the beauty that has resonated with readers for 100 years. See you in the pages.
Toby, thank you very much, and Nikki, thank you very much too. I'm sure there are questions. if you can formulate them. Yes.
Hello, Toby.
Hi.
This is not exactly a question, but I'm one of your graduates. I have been with you and several others to a Greek island where we read Homer's Odyssey, which is essential in getting to read Ulysses. I read Ulysses subjectively as well as objectively, as I'm from Dublin and also I'm Jewish. And there are so many memorable parts. I recognized some of the characters in the book. I introduced you to somebody whose mother was mentioned in the book. And there is one particular passage I'd just like to quote, which just shows Joyce's humor. Early in the book, Stephen Dedalus meets this old schoolmaster, Mr. Deasy, and he says to Mr. Deasy, "Was there ever any anti-Semitism in Ireland?" Mr. Deasy says, "No, there wasn't." He's asked, "Why not?" "They wouldn't let them in. They wouldn't let them in," he repeats. Really, reading Ulysses is life-enhancing. We've been to Dublin for Bloomsday for the last 2 years, and it is absolutely incredible. There are people dressed up in Edwardian costumes, riding bicycles around Dublin. Lots of restaurants and cafes have special meals, and if you haven't read it, give it a chance. Thank you.
Any more questions? Yes.
I haven't read it. Is it something that you can dip in and out of, or do you feel that you have to kind of read it, or not all in one go, but all in kind of one go?
That's a great question. That's a great question. So the question is, can you dip in and out of it if you haven't read it previously? And that wasn't my experience, but I have known people who have successfully done it that way. Because it isn't about sort of a building plot. I mean, there is a movement across the text. So I actually think that would be a manageable way to do it. The danger, I think, in doing that is that some of the threads that Joyce puts across the text, you may lose track of. But I also feel very strongly that you want to get through the first read, however it works for you, and then you come back and reread it. I think I sort of answered your question.
Yeah, can you tell us more about James Joyce and what sort of writer was he? Did he write in great bursts? Did he wake up early in the morning and write? Was he a writer through the night? I'm not sure I know how long he took to write the book. Was it all in handwriting, or were typewriters around by 1920? So just a bit more about his style as a writer.
Sure. Yep, absolutely. Joyce was always writing, and one of the things you need to know about Joyce is his eyesight really troubled him. So toward the end of his career, and I will go back, he was really not able to see, and he tried writing on huge pieces of paper in different color crayons. He ended up with a young secretary that he dictated to by the name of Beckett. I think there's a reason that Beckett chooses to do short, pithy works versus this. Joyce would write and rewrite and rewrite, and he really drove his publishers to distraction because he was always revising, and it's one of the reasons why there's a practically bloody ongoing dispute between Joyceans about which is the right edition. So I think that his Ulysses started as a short story and then just kept blowing up. And he kept going back in and adding more and expanding and more lists and other ways of opening up the texture of the language. And some of the examples I've seen of his drafts, you can't read it. I mean, it's crunched in and around the side. But he figured out what he meant. He famously because he and his family traveled a great deal, Trieste and Paris and Zurich, and he was terrible with money. They were impoverished, and he depended on a lot of different people to kind of support him. It was hard for him to pack up his whole library and keep it moving around, but we do have images where he would write in bed, which I don't think is a great idea. He'd have his bed up against the wall, and then he'd have this wall with a map of Dublin and schemas and sort of like what we would call like mind maps. I mean, it's an expression of a mind that is just galloping. So yeah, that's sort of his approach.
Would you recommend listening to it? And is there can you recommend a recording?
Yes, absolutely. And we're really lucky to be reading it just after the centenary, where many more opportunities, both for the audible version as well as more concordances and commentaries are available. Jim Norton does a brilliant audible version that you can get through the evil Amazon. But if you want to avoid Amazon, which is probably a good idea, the radio RTE does a wonderful dramatic performance with multiple voices, dramatic performance that's available on Spotify. It is so worth listening to, because one of the things that Joyce was classically trained as a singer, as a musician. And he has such a sense of the sound of language and the rhythm, the beats, the resonances of words. So when people are studying the text with me, I encourage them to take a dip into the text, then to listen to a version, and then maybe come back into the text. But it really sings. In fact, there's a whole chapter that's based on song, kind of written as an opera, and it's lovely to listen to it that way. Also, the audio versions often include some of the music that would have been resounding in Joyce's head. And we really should be hearing, for example, Love's Old Sweet Song as part of this. Anytime you read Ulysses, it just works into the text.
Hi, so just sort of jumping off your question, actually. So one of my favourite things when I'm reading a book is, particularly older ones, is trying to find out like what was the context, like personally, historically, and just kind of then going into the book and then kind of submerging yourself in the whole kind of what they were experiencing when they were writing it. So do you know anything about his like personal context, or what historical things happened while he was writing it?
Yeah, how long do we have? I can talk about this for a little
Just
while.
like top three.
No, and let me give you a couple sort of broad sketches and then one particular one. Joyce is writing in a time of incredible upheaval for Ireland. After the death of Charles Stuart Parnell, who was thought to be the great leader who was going to bring Ireland into an independent position, and the death of Parnell was heartbreaking for many people, and particularly for Joyce's family, who had advocated for Parnell and helped build electorate. I will go down a road that I better not go. So I'm going to now take a turn and say it was a time of extraordinary change in Ireland, whether or not Ireland was going to be able to step toward self-determinacy. They do in 1922, the year that the book is published. So Joyce is writing against that backdrop that is both about possibility and about violence. And he also, Joyce struggles greatly with nationalism and the danger of nationalism in any form, even Irish nationalism. Joyce felt that he couldn't stay in Ireland and be able to be an artist free in his mind. So he leaves Ireland and goes to Paris on his own first and gets called back, mother dying, come home father. Now, one of the other things you need to know about Joyce is that his family, when he was born, his family was fairly comfortably off, but that his father drank too much, he didn't manage his finances, and they basically went from fairly comfortable middle class to starving. Joyce at that point had left, and this is a real struggle for him. He walked away from his family because he could not save them. And he puts that into the text. But he's also writing from a position of knowing the shame and the discomfort of extreme poverty. Launches himself off to Paris with Nora Barnacle, not marrying her. And it is from there that he starts writing Ulysses. But he's writing Ulysses from 1914 to 1922. So it is with a war, the Great War, going on around him. One of the very specific answers I would give to your question is also, and Colm Toybin does a beautiful job of discussing this in Mad, Bad, Dangerous to Know. I think one of the things that fires Joyce is to try to come to peace with what both his world as an Irish person and more specifically his family has given him. Because his family, his father, he was horrified at what he saw of his father's drunkenness and abuse of his mother. His first writing, his earlier writing, is really bitter about his father. And what I feel he does in Ulysses is he finds a way to express both what he honors about his father and how his father inspires with the use of the playfulness of language, the great sort of raconteur, the mimic, and reclaim a bit, not his father, but his ability to hold his father in a place that isn't brittle. I better stop there. But it's a great question. There's Richard Ellman, big biography. That's one you can dip in and out of. Some wonderful stuff. Joyce's movement around as an exile is in itself a wonderful, wonderful story.
Can you talk about Joyce and women and how he sort of presented the female perspective, or his perspective of women and desire and Molly and all that?
Can we read Penelope? It's a great question. And it's one of the reasons why I love this book, is because he gives expression to female desire. Sometimes maybe a little bit clunky, certainly within his time, but his central character, Bloom, is curious about the experience of menstruation, curious about what women go through in childbirth, curious about what it is to be a woman in that time. And he does this wonderful chapter. I was actually just we were studying it today, Nausicaa, the first half of which is written in the voice not of a young woman, but the young woman as influenced by the girls' periodicals, young women's journals of the time. And it's hard to hear because it is just kind of dripping sweet. But what Joyce shows us, he's not making fun of that voice, but he's situating that voice in the text and showing how this young woman struggles to express what happens to her body with a language that will not talk about female sexuality and desire. That chapter got him in trouble. And then he wrote Penelope. And he kind of lets it go. I mean, he says this is the interior experience of a female. Now this is tricky, right? Because it's a male. He's writing about a female experience. Limitations, maybe, but he is offering to step into female experience and honor it. Yeah.
I would just comment that even for a woman, it's almost unbearably visceral at times, which is a statement of the obvious.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And Molly tends to be a very controversial voice. Yeah.
So, I think we can continue this conversation. Is there someone? Oh, you're doing all the work.
The status of Ulysses is now assured, I think, but how was it received when it was first published? And what were the difficulties Joyce had in getting it published at all?
Yes, so he had really, really struggled. I think it took him 14 years to get Dubliners published. And Ulysses nobody wanted to touch it. The rumors about its obscenity preceded it. He had had it published. So interestingly, actually, there are a lot of women who were involved in the ability finally to get the text published, including Jane Heap and Margaret Anderson, who were a couple in Greenwich Village, New York City, and they put it in the Little Review. They put a couple episodes in the Little Review, and that got them in an enormous amount of trouble. And because the Little Review was publishing episodes before the text was published, it was getting people's attention. But I just want to read briefly a quote. The trial, the obscenity trial, which was in 1921 in the United States, they can be very funny about sort of Puritan obscenity issues. Anyway, the trial is discussed in Girls Lean Back Everywhere. And this is the great line that Jane Heap wrote of James Joyce. Mr. Joyce was not teaching early Egyptian perversions or inventing new ones. Girls lean back everywhere, showing lace and silk stockings, wear low-cut sleeveless blouses, breathless bathing suits. Men think thoughts and have emotions about these things everywhere, seldom as delicately and imaginatively as Mr. Bloom in the Nausicaa episode, and no one is corrupted. Joyce, so it is Sylvia Beach of the Shakespeare and Company who is finally the one that says, okay, I'll publish it. She never published a book in her life. The very sad story is that Joyce took advantage of her and she did not make what she should have made from the publication of Ulysses. And you have stories of various people trying to transfer Joyce's notes into typewritten material and people getting upset, a husband coming home reading what the wife is typing up and setting fire to it, a woman who was typing it up running to Shakespeare and Company and throwing the pages in the door and running away screaming. I mean, it was not easy. But Sylvia Beach managed to get it done through a French publisher. People like to say they didn't know what they were publishing. And then it would be, I would say it would take another 10 or 20 years for it to actually take off and for the buzz around the obscenity to dissipate and for the brilliance to show through. One more question.
Virginia Woolf's response was very interesting. She saw him as something of a peasant upstart, I think. Does that tell us more about Virginia Woolf than it does about James Joyce?
It's a really unfortunate thing that she, in a letter to a friend, talks quite disparagingly about Joyce. And she makes fun of his class, which is really unfortunate. It's not the only thing that Woolf had to say about Joyce. She was in awe of his work. And I think what we hear there is a bit of professional jealousy. Because Mrs. Dalloway has the fingerprints of Ulysses all over it, which, and as Joyce takes what he is struggling with in his world and puts it into the text and kind of gives it exposure, I think Virginia Woolf does something similar. And she takes her snobbery and excavates it within the work of the text. a day in the life, and there are actually some very similar images that you know that she's read it cover to cover, and it is impressed upon her mind and her creativity. So it's unfortunate that that's how she's quoted, but she said it. But I do, and there are other places where she speaks with great respect of what he's done. We need to read those letters more.
Right, I think...
she was a bit disparaging. She could be a little cutting.
We can continue this conversation next door over a glass of wine. And I found it a very stimulating evening, and I certainly will embark on a second reading. I hope those who haven't read it have been inspired.
We have a copy on display in the library if anyone's interested.
So thank you, Toby, thank you, Nikki, for your splendid readings, and please come next door. Or first of all, we'll say
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Osman. Thank you.